I'm not in panic mode for Oregon's 2026 recruiting class. I am wondering, when's the good news coming back?
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. We're talking wide receivers. We're talking DBs. But first, we're talking recruiting. We're doing it all today with my guy, Max Torres, ScoopDuck.com over at On3, the Ducks Dish podcast. I feel like Star-Lord in the first Guardians of the Galaxy when someone finally calls him that, because he says Star-Lord and Chris Pratt says, finally. And that's how I feel getting Max back on the show, because it's been, I don't know how long, but far too long. So let's hop into the recruiting stuff, Max, because you cover that really closely over at Scoop Duck with a bunch of great stuff. The last month, let's not sugarcoat it for Oregon recruiting, has been a downward trend compared to where I think they will be by the time the 2026 class gets finished, and certainly from where they started. They're down to number 6, which is, high-class problems and such, but they're down to number 6 nationally in the 24/7 Sports national rankings, and it's just been a couple of decommitments. Chris Henry Jr., the Ohio State 5-star that Oregon was maybe going to try to flip, he shut down his recruitment. Kind of feels like right now the next major piece that would bring Oregon fans good news on the trail is kind of Jared Curtis.
It's definitely been a net negative of the last month, but I think it's important to keep timing in perspective, Spencer, and just where we're at on the recruiting calendar. Because what Oregon's class looks like now is probably going to be quite a bit different from what it looks like come signing day in December. And part of the reason the Ducks haven't had a whole lot of momentum is the decommits, like you talked about. Of course, we have to acknowledge those. But also, I think it comes with not having spring practice. Like, you're not going to bring guys out to Eugene to visit if you don't have something to show them. And I think that now that they're resuming spring practice, we're going to see guys coming into Eugene all throughout the month. So Jared Curtis is definitely the guy that we have our eyes on. I don't know if you want to get into it now, but Cody Green is certainly one that we're keeping close tabs on, and there could be some kind of news as soon as this month. But I think it's been slow, but I don't think it's going to be like that for long. I don't think that Dan Lanning and the Ducks are going to be quiet for too terribly long here in the 26 class, and maybe we'll even see something get going with the 27 class as well.
Yeah, there's a running back committing on Saturday. I don't think he's expected to pick Oregon. The Ducks are in one of 6 schools, which is a lot to have as a final 6 to be deciding between. But I don't think Oregon is going to be in the fold there. I mean, they could. I mean, Oregon's pulled rabbits out of hats before on the recruiting trail. But I mean, to what we were both hinting at, Max, like the last month has essentially been 2 decommitments, and neither one has officially flipped, but one might be flipping to Washington, one might be flipping to USC. Again, that's a might. And then Chris Henry Jr., which would have been, I would have been over the moon if they'd somehow been able to land the number 1 receiver in back-to-back classes. He shuts it down, and you just kind of look around and go, well, it's just kind of flatlined a little bit. And then another piece of news that I want to get into with you, because you had a piece about it over at Scoop Duck. Cody Green is someone that is still fielding offers. He has not shut down his recruitment. Kendra Harrison, Tredarian Ball, they have for the Ducks, which is great. I love both of those guys. But Cody Green is someone who's still open, and he is being pursued pretty heavily by heavy hitters on the trail.
Yeah, so Cody Green has taken a couple of visits recently. Well, it was at USC, and then is going to be at Oregon this weekend before also getting out to Texas. And Washington, it looks like, is also going to get a trip from him this month. I'm not super surprised to see Washington get a visit from him. He is from Seattle, so I think that only makes sense. But I don't really view that as a threat for Oregon here. I think if we're really being honest, it's looking like USC is the biggest threat. We'll see if things change after his trip out to Texas. His teammate Mark Bowman, another Oregon target, was out on the 40 acres in Austin over the weekend. But this is an interesting one, Spencer, because I wrote in that update that Cody Green could be coming to somewhat of a newer decision, before official visits start. And that essentially is whether he wants to stick with Oregon or continue to pursue other options and see what lies ahead there. So this weekend's huge for Green and the Ducks. He wants to see how Leak Terry coaches live and in person, and then he'll compare that to Zach Hansen at USC and Kyle Flood at Texas. So I think that Oregon's in a good spot to hang on right now, but at the same time, we can't sit here and ignorantly dismiss what USC is doing on the recruiting trail, because they're doing a heck of a job. And whether or not those guys sign come December is a different story, but they're the hot team right now, and they're making all the right moves.
Yeah, they've got the top class in the country, 17 players, and that's more than anybody else, which is part of the reason they have the number one class, but they're also not recruiting a bunch of, lowly rated, low expectation sort of guys. Like they have a couple of real dudes in there to support that current number one class ranking. It's going to be hard to hold on to, and certainly Oregon's a school that can get back into that sort of range. You think about a guy like Brandon Arrington, a 5-star athlete who USC's after, who Oregon's after, other schools in the fold as well. He's going to commit at some point. That'll impact class rankings a whole heck of a lot. And I want to go back to what you mentioned about, it might be picking up for Oregon here in a couple weeks. Maybe even there's a commit. Spring practice is underway. 4-star wideout Messiah Hampton posted an Instagram story that he's back on campus right now. You mentioned Green coming to town this weekend too. But leading up to the spring game, I think that's a pretty big, and I imagine it's part of why Dan Lanning wants to keep having one. I think that's, kind of the pinnacle of spring recruiting from kind of February to April. And then in May, you start to get into official visit season.
Yeah, it's more or less par for the course, Spencer. Like between now and mostly the end of May, official visits are starting earlier and earlier, which is kind of just another thing we have to adjust to. Like June is usually and still will be the month for official visits. And then we'll get into some more commitments from players, whether it's to Oregon or other schools, and we'll have a much better feel for what this 2026 class is going to look like. And then we'll get into the season, and they'll be able to really kind of go full steam ahead on some of those top tier guys that might still be uncommitted or those late flips they're pushing for. And then before you know it, we'll be on to the 2027 class. But I think this is really just par for the course. I know that it hasn't been the best month or so for Oregon and Dan Lanning, but it's not like they forgot how to recruit. I think part of it is just getting back to spring practice, getting guys on campus, which is happening right now. You talk about Messiah Hampton. We can speak a bit more on him later. But I think things are going to be fine for Oregon. It's just a matter of getting guys on campus, like I said, and just continuing to chop wood and then sell the product that they have, which is a darn good one, and one that will continue to sell itself later this month when they hold the draft and more guys become pro Ducks.
I think the next big fish in the pond of 2026 recruits is Jared Curtis. That's the sense that I get. Cody Green is... I saw he just got a ratings boost from a couple of services because he's a complete and total stud at offensive tackle, high 4 or 5-star guy, depending on where you look. And I still think Curtis is kind of the next big new news that Oregon going to get. Not that, if Messiah Hampton commits between now and the spring game, great. But I'm still, in the back of my mind, paying attention to May 5th and seeing where Jared Curtis goes, because that is a special player at quarterback. He is a Justin Herbert, Josh Allen type sort of build. And frankly, I think he's far more refined coming out of high school than either of those guys were. So that's kind of the next, unless there's someone that you've got on the top of your mind, that's the next big name that I would expect to come off the board, whether to Oregon or somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's the guy that I'm mainly highlighting on my end as well. I'm looking through some of the offers to see if anybody else pops into my mind. But I think right now, just with the timelines in the decision timelines that we know of, I would probably agree with you and say that that's the guy that we're kind of waiting. That could be the next domino to fall here for Oregon in the 2026 class. And the thing with Jared Curtis that's interesting is not only that he chose to delay his decision another month and some change, probably going to be getting back out to both schools. But I wrote about it earlier today on Scoop Duck. Like, if this does come down to an NIL situation, is this one that Oregon is okay with being outbid for? Or are they saying there's no chance we're losing this guy if it's coming down to to dollars and cents, because we're hearing about...
I think that depends on how they feel about the Ryder Lions recruitment.
See, I mean, that makes sense, but to me, it's like, and I wrote about this again, it's like, are you all in on Jared Curtis, or is it like, hey, if he goes to Georgia, he goes to Georgia, we're all in on Ryder Lions, but then does that mean that you don't take a quarterback in 2026 because we know about his mission trip and he's essentially a 2027 recruit? Like, these are all questions that are tied into what Jared Curtis wants to do come May 5th. And I was talking about how Georgia and Kirby Smart are, reportedly trying to pony up a little bit in the NIL department, which just kind of sounds crazy because you never think of a school like Georgia not being competitive in that space. And that's not what I'm saying, but I guess they just want to double down even more in that regard. But it's going to be fun to see because over this next month or so, obviously we're going to see what happens with Jared Curtis, but in the time between now and May 5th, Spencer, I'm interested to see what Oregon does with other 2026 quarterbacks or doesn't do with other 2026 quarterbacks, because maybe that's going to be indicative of how they feel they stand in that recruitment.
I'm interested to see how Max and I view the wide receiver room for this very year. You don't possibly want to miss that, do you? First, this episode brought to you by Supply House. Get the supplies you need from the site made for the skilled trades. Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts with over 400 top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast, just like the Big Ten. From USC to Rutgers, they've got it covered. Need help with an order? Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trademaster program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trademaster program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. I could give you a lot of different ways the wide receiver room shakes out for 2025. I could see Jerion Dickey having a role. I could see Jerion Dickey not having a role. I could see Justice Lowe, who I talked about yesterday, having 400 to 500 yards. I could see him having 100 yards by the end of the season. So I wanted to discuss this with you, Max, because I'm too far down the rabbit hole. I need someone to pull me out and just settle things down. I tell you right now, give me with 3 receiver spots, 2 outside guys, X and Z, and then the slot position. Who do you think are the top 6 Oregon receivers, and who fills out the 2 deep?
Oh, top 6. Okay. I need to be better about, hammering down the X, Y, and Z specifically. But I think we definitely have to throw a guy like Gary Bryant Jr. in there because he's been around a lot. And I think it's just about him being healthy more than anything. And DeCorian Moore is going to be in that mix, I think. We haven't seen a wide receiver at Oregon this hyped since I don't even know who.
Never. He's the highest rated Oregon receiver recruit ever. The previous high was Cameron Colvin back in, I think it was the 06 class, kind of 05, 6, 7 range. And Cameron Colvin was a fine player, but he did not live up to that billing.
Yeah. So I think DeCorian's in there. And then you also have Malik Benson probably somewhere in there, the Florida State transfer, Kyler Casper, Justice Lowe, and
Evan Stewart.
Obviously I have to put Evan Stewart in there as well. Thank you. I don't know if that was quite 6, but I think those are probably the Jeremiah McLaughlin, I think, is another one we have to talk about as well. I'm going to be very interested to see how much of him we see on the field for Ross Douglas come fall.
Yeah, so that's what I find to be most interesting is I wonder what information the staff has right now about this position group going into spring practice or as it unfolds. Obviously, we know at this point with Dan Lanning and the staff, they're not going to give us anything, right? We can sit here and prognosticate about it from now until the season begins when we will actually know, because I don't think the spring game will give us a clear indication. It'll give us information, but it won't give us a concrete 2 deep necessarily. But you think about the slot receiver position. I can see 3 guys being the starter, quite frankly, at the slot position spot. Justice Lowe filled in for Tez Johnson when he got hurt against Michigan, and he had 6 receptions in that game, which was the most he'd had in a game in his Oregon career. And remember, Justice Lowe's going into his 4th year of college football. He's a redshirt junior. So he's plenty acclimated to college and the playbook. It's his third year with Will Stein as offensive coordinator. Yeah, he's got a new receivers coach, but the verbiage and everything is not going to change. So he knows all of that. Then you have Gary Bryant, who's also a fifth-year player who was a borderline 5-star receiver coming out of high school. And then you've got DeCorian Moore. I think the popular answer for fans, and quite frankly for myself, is I want it to be DeCorian Moore because of all the potential he has. But is he good enough to step in with as much hype as he has, Max? Is he good enough to just step in day one and be the starting slot receiver over two guys who have a combined 9 years of college football experience? I think, Gary Bryant started, in 2020. So this would actually be his 6th year, 10 years. Yeah, 10 years of experience between those two. Is DeCorian that much better? I think that's a steep hill for him to climb.
It could be, but I mean, everything I've heard about him is that he's the real deal, like a legitimate first-round talent, which Oregon hasn't had at the wide receiver position, whether you think Troy Franklin should have been drafted there or not. Best receiver that they've had in program history. Tez Johnson is certainly in there from a production standpoint as well. Jeff Mail, there you go. But I think that, I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see not only if DeCorian Moore can play to that level, but if the staff can make that decision, because I think that requires a certain level of confidence and certainty as well, because we just haven't seen young wide receivers take on that large of a role at Oregon. I guess Troy Franklin kind of did, but we all know about the Cristobal offense and how they refuse to pass the ball sometimes. But I think I've got all the excitement, anticipation, and lofty expectations of the world for DeCorian, and I think he's going to be able to be everything that people thought he was coming out of high school.
Yeah, and Franklin was a borderline 5-star, and I remember the phrase that we were talking about coming out of that Alamo Bowl was unleash the skinnies, him and Dante Thornton. And Thornton went on, by the way, most of the guys that transfer out of Oregon don't go on to find super successful spots. Dante Thornton's one of the exceptions to that generalized rule. He went to Tennessee, did really well. He ran at the NFL Combine, I think like a 4. I think he ran like a 4. Didn't he run like a 4.27 or? He ran
that like a 4.33 or something.
Yeah, he ran something really fast. Like he turned out to be a really good player for the Vols. But again, that freshman year for Troy Franklin, he was not a big part of the offense. He was not one of the top receivers. His second year he was. And the only player in the history of Oregon football, different position of course, that's a higher rated recruit than DeCorian Moore, Max, is Kayvon Thibodeau. And if you even look at his true freshman season, now there's more physical adaptation required and adjustment when you're playing defensive line than when you're playing receiver. But even Kayvon Thibodeau, who was worth the hype across the board, no doubt about it, he did not start right away in his college career with the Ducks. And I have wondered more than a couple times, and will continue to wonder until we see it play out, is that what we see with DeCorian? Is it a Gary Bryant or a Justice Lowe? And Justice Lowe could play on the outside too. He's 6'1". He's skinnier, but he's 6'1". He could play out there. Is it Gary Bryant at first, and then once DeCorian learns the playbook really well, gets settled to the college lifestyle and the college game and all that sort of stuff, he's the guy by the end of the year? Or does it end up being a true split? Or does DeCorian Moore have 300 yards receiving this year and we say, nope, his sophomore year is when he pops for 1,000 yards or more?
Yeah, it remains to be seen how much we're going to see of DeCorian. I think that the opportunity, you couldn't ask for a better one. I agree. I think that the top end experience that you have is Evan Stewart, Gary Bryant, and Malik Benson. But really, I think that Evan Stewart is probably the most productive of those guys. Gary Bryant is in there as well, but it's wide open. I'm also excited about Cooper Perry, Dylan Gresham, a couple of other wide receivers, some younger guys in that room. I'm excited to see what they can do, and I think I want to see everyone get a shot, and that's really what the spring game is going to be.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the most interesting position groups to watch, along with secondary, which we're going to talk about to wrap up today's show. The other thought I've had about the receiver room, Max, I think someone will transfer out in the spring portal window. I'd actually be kind of surprised if somebody does. There are just so many so many players in that room. They're not all going to play. Maybe a bunch of them don't, and they expect to go the Justice Lowe route and wait, until his third year of college was when he actually started playing at all, and that was only because of an injury. Maybe some guys are okay with that. All right. I would not be shocked if a Perry or heck, even a McLaughlin, if he doesn't fly his way up the depth chart a little bit, or a Casper or a Dick. Like if one of those guys, do I sound crazy? Because to me, it seems perfectly logical that the receiver room could see a transfer departure.
I think it makes sense. Just with all the young guys they have in that room, like you said, and a coaching change, that also kind of alters things sometimes. I never want to speculate about transfers, but you could certainly make the case, is what I'm saying, Spencer.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm sitting here. I'm making the case. I am the speculator, some would say. That's a nickname I just gave myself for no particular reason. But to wrap up today's show, we're talking defensive backs because, speaking of questions, there are a lot in the secondary. Can this year's secondary be better? That's coming up next. First, this episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment? It's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. All in one convenience. That's what they're all about. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. monarchmoney.com.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
All right, Max, let's talk about the perimeter guys on the other side of the ball. A question came in from a Locked On Ducks insider, which you can all be below. Click the link in the description, free 14-day trial. That's a way to get priority access to the mailbag. You can also just submit questions via Twitter, YouTube, all that good stuff. One of you out there asked, can this year's secondary be better than 2024? And I want to say yes. My inclination is no. And my reasoning is that the 6 guys that you lost were the 6 guys. It's not just 6 players from last year's secondary. I mean, it's 7 if you count, Tyler Turner, who was a guy that barely saw the field and mostly did so in garbage time. I just think asking that unit to be able to play at the same level, and I know they weren't good in the Rose Bowl, Max, but for the most part over the course of last season, they were really good. And Jabbar Muhammad is probably about to get drafted. Dillon Thieneman's the only guy who I even know in my head is going to be a starter this year. So that's why I pumped the brakes on this year. They'll automatically be better. At least early on, I don't have that expectation.
Yeah, I think it's too early to say something like that with a lot of confidence, right? Because we just don't even know what the starting group's going to look like. Heck, we haven't seen a lot of these guys on the field hardly at all. So that's hard. I think it certainly has the potential to, and maybe from an athletic profile, this is a more exciting group than last year's secondary, but it remains to be seen until we see these guys on the field and how they gel and how they communicate, and if the scheme is too complicated or not for them. I think that's something that we have to also consider here, Spencer, is there were times when the defense just wasn't ready last year because they were trying to check and get in the right spot and all that. So I think that's definitely on the bolder side for takes, but I think just knowing the guys that are in that group and the potential that they have, I think it's possible, but certainly not likely with the information that we have here in April.
The way that I thought about this question is, let's go spot by spot. right? With your 5 starting defensive backs in, the base personnel that Lanning and Lupoy have been running ever since they got here. No indication that that's going to change. And in a pass-happy world of football, don't really think that it should. Dillon Thieneman, I do think, is the best individual player at safety Oregon has had since Dan Lanning arrived. I fully agree with that. So in that sense, whether you want to compare him to Tysheem Johnson or Kobe Savage, I think Thieneman can be a pretty significant upgrade there. So that's one spot where, yes, I'll give you that. But then at the outside corner spots, who can you say right now is definitively a better cover guy than Jabbar Muhammad? I don't know that you can either. Maybe Jalil Florence, who has an injury question because he didn't play last year due to said injury. Is he the same guy? Is he able to come back? If so, all right. I think he could be as good as Jabbar, but I think Jalil Florence at his peak, Jabbar Muhammad at his peak, Jabbar's a better player, so he's got to take a step forward with that. Then you go to the nickel position. I thought Brandon Johnson was really good for Oregon last year. I thought he did a lot of good things. I thought Nico Reed did a lot of good things for the Ducks. I frankly thought the corner positions, the 2 outside guys in the nickel, I thought those spots were good, and I think safety is where Oregon was relatively weaker, and so you take out a guy in Nico Reed who made huge strides from 2023 to 2024, and you're replacing him with Theron Johnson from Northwestern, maybe? Kennedy, the transfer from Ole Miss, maybe? Roderick Pleasant, Ife Obadegwu, nobody's got the proven track record of they're better than those guys, so that's why I throttle back on this question of the secondary's better this year. 2026, though, if you're able to bring Thieneman back for his 4th season of college football, could be the best secondary Oregon's seen since 2019.
Yeah, and I think also with next season, if we get to December or November and the secondary play is better than it was last year, what a hell of a job Chris Hampton and Rashad Wadood will have done to get that group to that point. So with my answer and analysis here, Spencer, I certainly don't want to rule that out. Although I do think it is not as likely. But I think that this is a group that just needs to gel and get experience together and see what this 2 deep looks like, because like we've talked about, it could go a whole lot of different ways right now.
Yeah, and I like the core of young guys they have. 2025, best recruiting year for a group of secondary players in the history of Oregon football. And I'll get you out of here on this. DeCorian Moore is the guy that draws the most interest in this 2025 class on offense, and that answer is very easily Naeem Offord. On defense, my guy Brian Smith, bullish that he plays in some capacity as a true freshman. Maybe he starts at one of the outside corner spots. Maybe he starts, I just combined spots and slots. That was cool. But maybe he starts at one of those positions. Maybe he winds up starting at nickel. I still think no matter how talented you are, relying on a true freshman compared to how experienced last year's group was, I think is just going to have at least a few moments where you go, that was not great.
Yeah, you don't want to find yourself relying on true freshmen. There's a huge difference between relying on a true freshman and being confident in a true freshman. I always think back, and I'm sure I'll get more examples as I go on in my career, but I always think back to Thomas Graham when he was starting as a true freshman at Oregon. I don't think he was starting because he was head and shoulders above the rest, and this is a dude we have to have out on the field. It was night and day difference recruiting wise. I mean, the 2017 class to the 2025 class, my God, come on, Spencer. That was very much a, hey, this is what we got. Have fun out there. So I don't think that we're going to see necessarily a lot of guys playing out of necessity. If it is, if we do see young guys, I think it's going to be because they proved themselves. But I think that one of Dakota Fields and Ife Obadegwu are going to see a whole bunch of snaps, and I can't wait to see those guys.
Yeah, second-year players, outside corner prospects, both highly rated 4-star recruits for the Ducks last cycle. I'm interested to see which of those guys wind up popping. But, man, I just – if Offord gets in there and is just living up to the billing, that's a foundational piece of your secondary going forward for the Ducks. And I kind of wish at some level that this staff would approach this season the way Mario Cristobal and company did back then where they played guys like Thomas Graham early, or they had the 4 freshman offensive linemen who just grew together over years, culminating in a Pac-12 championship season in 2019. And, of course, accentuated with Penei Sewell getting in there because that guy was a freaking monster and still is. I kind of want to see that because they have all this talent, but in order for them to grow and have that season that everybody dreams about when they commit to the Ducks, they've got to take their lumps a little bit. They've got to grow and learn. But, the biggest thing that I'm sure the staff will be looking for after the last 2 games they played last year, Max, to your point earlier, is they've got to figure out how to deal with tempo and motion. Because Penn State did that the whole game, threw them off. And Ohio State watched the film and said, they can't handle tempo, they can't handle motion. They did all of those things. Miscommunications, not getting on the same page. And that probably makes it harder for younger guys to play in the short term, but you got to learn how to do it at some point. Max Torres, the Ducks Dish Podcast, Scoop Duck over at On3. Max, love it as always, my man. I appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.